The rain came down hard against the windows of the copper lantern, and inside, 8 tables were halfway through their dinners, candles burning, an old jazz record crackling through the speaker on the wall. An ordinary Friday night in Fairmount, in the city of Philadelphia. Then Bradley Kessler stood up. He took hold of his wife's wrist right there in the aisle, didn't hide it, didn't lower his voice, didn't bother to glance around and see who might be watching. The tray in Delaney Whitfield's hands tilted. 3 glasses went down onto the tile floor and broke into a small run of bells. "You people want to know what I married?" Bradley said, loud enough for the whole room to catch every word. 3 years. 3 years I've carried a woman who's never given me a thing. You know what it's like to marry a dead end? Delaney didn't pull her hand away. She bent down and started picking up the glass. And that was the terrible thing in that room, not what he said, but the way she bent down, calm, practiced, like a woman who had done this so many times she no longer had to think about it. 8 tables looked somewhere else. Somebody coughed. Somebody reached for their water. Not one person stood up in the kitchen. Marguerite Delacroix tightened her grip on the handle of her knife and did not come out. Then, at the corner table by the window, a man set his fork down on his plate. That was all. One small sound of metal against china, so quiet no one should have heard it, but the whole room turned. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even get out of his chair. He just looked straight at Bradley and spoke in the tone a man uses to read out the weather. "Take your hand off her now." Bradley laughed. He had no idea yet who he was talking to. The man at the corner table was named August Riordan, in Philadelphia. Nobody ever made him say a thing twice. Before the sun came up, Bradley Kessler would lose every single thing that had his name on it, and you're going to watch it happen. But there was one thing Riordan didn't see coming. 3 years earlier, another rainy night, the woman he'd just saved had put her name on a piece of paper. She signed it because a man was crying. She signed it because, for the first time in her life, somebody needed her. And that piece of paper sitting quiet in a file drawer for 3 long years was going to destroy them both. If this story reaches you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with Delaney. To understand how Delaney's life reached that sudden breaking point, we must first look at the quiet, suffocating prison she lived in every single day. On a typical night before the storm broke, Bradley Kessler's car was parked in the farthest corner of the lot, where the streetlights couldn't reach. He walked ahead. Delaney Whitfield followed behind, and neither of them said a word. The rain had thinned into a fine mist, the kind that wasn't heavy enough to make people run, but cold enough to make them remember. He opened the car door for her. That was the frightening part. He opened it for her like a courteous husband in an insurance commercial, and she lowered herself into the seat, fastened her seatbelt, and placed both hands in her lap. He didn't turn on the radio during the entire drive home. There was only the steady sweep of the windshield wipers across the glass, and the sound of his breathing, even, slow, controlled. Delaney looked out the window. Closed storefronts drifted past, their signs dark, a man walking his dog through the rain. She counted the streetlights. She always did. When she was a child, she counted the stairs in the houses people sent her to, because counting was the only thing no one could take away from her. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a red brick building north of Fairmount. Bradley unlocked the door, switched on the kitchen light, hung his coat on a hook, and sat down at the dining table. He didn't shout. He never shouted inside the apartment. He pulled open the bottom drawer, took out the blue-covered ledger, set it on the table, and smoothed the cover with the flat of his palm. "Give it to me," he said. Delaney removed her apron, turned out the pockets, and placed the money on the table. Crumpled $1 bills, several 5s, 1 10. She arranged them into a stack, all facing the same direction, because the first time she hadn't done it that way. He had made her start over 3 times while he sat there watching. He licked his thumb and turned the page. The ledger had grown thicker over the years, its pages curling at the edges like dried leaves. Inside was handwriting, small, perfectly even, in blue ink divided into 3 columns: date, shift, amount. There was no column bearing her name. There didn't need to be. The entire ledger was about her. He counted the stack of money. Then he counted it again. Then he picked up a pencil and tapped lightly at the 10 pages back. "Last Friday," he said. $83. Delaney didn't answer. "Tonight," he said. 76. He looked up. The kitchen light fell across his face, deepening the hollows beneath his cheekbones. He wasn't angry. That was what she had learned in 3 years, and what no one outside this apartment could ever understand. He was never angry. He was simply right. "You think I can't count?" "The diner was slow tonight," she said. Her voice was quiet and flat, a voice she had worn smooth over 3 years until there wasn't a single sharp edge left for him to seize. The rain. "Table 4 left out early. Table 4, he repeated. He wrote those 2 words in the margin. Then he circled them. "All right, I'll remember table 4. He closed the ledger. He returned it to the bottom drawer, pushed the drawer shut, and stood. "Go to sleep," he said. Then he went into the bedroom, turned off the light, and turned the lock. That sound. It wasn't loud, just a dry metallic click. The sound of something very small sliding precisely into its proper place. Delaney stood in the dark hallway, her hand still carrying the smell of bleach and vinegar, and listened to it. She didn't knock. She had knocked once, in the 4th month. She never knocked again. She sat down on the floor with her back against the door. The cold wood seeped through the thin fabric of her uniform. Somewhere down the street, the siren of an ambulance faded into the distance. She drew her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and closed her eyes. Across the hallway stood the storage closet. Its door was opened by a narrow crack. Inside, beneath a pile of winter coats and a broken vacuum cleaner, was a small brown suitcase. It had been there for 3 years. It had never been fully unpacked. Her clothes were still inside, folded into neat squares, arranged into layers, ready. She had one drawer in the bedroom which Bradley had cleared for her during the first week, and in it she kept 3 shirts and a sewing box. Every spring, she opened the suitcase, moved the winter clothes to the bottom, and placed the summer clothes on top. Then she closed it. She locked it. She pushed it back into the corner of the closet. 3 years. No one had ever asked her why. The employee restroom at the Copper Lantern was exactly the size of a standing closet, and Delaney Whitfield had learned how to do everything in there without turning on the light. She slid the bolt into place, leaned her back against the cold tiled wall, and emptied the pocket of her apron into her palm. Tips from the afternoon shift were always more scattered than those from the evening shift, mostly $1 bills and loose coins. But today there was a 10 from the regular who sat at the bar, the man in the Phillies cap who always ordered the same meal and always left exactly that amount, year after year, as steady as the clock. She counted. $61. Then she counted again, more slowly, and separated 2 $5 bills from the rest. She removed her right shoe, lifted the insole, and slipped the 2 bills underneath, pressing them flat with her thumb. There was enough room there for 3 bills before they began to form a lump beneath her foot when she walked. She had tried 4 once during the previous winter and had limped through the entire evening, and when she got home that night, she had been forced to lie about the shoes. She never tried 4 again. She put the shoe back on, stamped her foot twice against the floor, and straightened. In the mirror, beneath the slightly yellow bulb, stood a 27-year-old woman with the eyes of someone far older, and Delaney didn't look at her for long. She never looked for long. She opened the bolt, and at that exact moment 2 knocks sounded against the wooden door. Not quick, not impatient, just 2 quiet knocks. "The soup's getting cold," Marguerite Delacroix said from the other side. Then the soft shuffle of her slippers receded toward the kitchen. She didn't wait for Dethese to answer. She never did. Delaney stepped out, and on the kitchen windowsill sat a bowl of soup on a saucer, a spoon, and 3 thick slices of bread. Tomato beef stew, the Saturday dish, though today wasn't Saturday. Zarg stood with her back turned at the stove, stirring a pan of onions, and she didn't look around. She didn't ask how the previous night had gone. She didn't ask why Delaney had arrived 40 minutes before her shift. She didn't look at her wrist, didn't look at her face, didn't look anywhere on her body. She simply stirred the onions, and in that cramped kitchen filled with steam, her silence felt thick and warm, like a blanket someone had quietly laid over her shoulders. Delaney picked up the bowl and ate standing against the refrigerator, swallowing quickly, the spoon clicking against the ceramic. She ate like someone stealing something that already belonged to her. She finished in less than 2 minutes, rinsed the bowl beneath the faucet, placed it upside down on the rack, and didn't say thank you. Because the first time she had thanked Marge, the older woman had looked at her in a strange way. And from then on, Delaney understood that in this kitchen, people didn't thank one another for things that were never supposed to be acknowledged as existing. She took the 3 slices of bread, wrapped them in a paper napkin, and tucked them into her apron pocket. Then she pushed open the back door and stepped into the alley. The rain had stopped completely. The alley behind the diner was narrow and wet, heavy with the smell of old frying oil and rotting cardboard, and at the far end, behind a row of blue trash bins, there was a cardboard box she had lined with a torn sweater in the fall. She crouched down, broke the bread into crumbs in her palm, and gave 2 short whistles. It came out after about 10 seconds, a painfully thin tabby with fur the color of baked biscuits, its left front leg missing entirely. It didn't walk, it bounded, its 3 legs pushing its whole body forward in a rhythm it had invented and perfected for itself, and it had never once behaved as though it knew that rhythm was unusual. "Hello, Biscuit," Delaney said. The cat pressed its head against her wrist, then bent to eat. She stayed there on her heels in the alley, watching it finish the last crumbs and lick its mouth. And for those 3 brief minutes each day, no one in the world knew where she was, and no one in the world wrote it down in any ledger at all. On Wednesday afternoon, the Copper Lantern was as empty as a church in the middle of the week, and Delaney Whitfield was polishing glasses at the service station when Marguerite Delacre came out of the kitchen, something she almost never did while customers were still in the dining room. She didn't say anything to anyone. She simply walked straight to the corner table by the window, the 2-seat table the diner usually used to hold boxes of spare menus, and cleared it with both hands, carried the boxes into the back, then returned with a fresh tablecloth, spread it smooth, and adjusted the candle holder. Then she took a bottle of wine from the cabinet that Delaney had never seen on the menu, a dark red bottle with no price label, and placed it on the table with 2 glasses. When she was finished, she went back into the kitchen without offering a single word of explanation. The man arrived about half an hour later, alone. He was tall, dressed in a gray wool coat, and he entered the diner in a way Delaney needed a moment to understand. He didn't look for a table. He walked directly to the corner as though it had been waiting there for him for 20 years. He didn't remove his coat. He simply sat down with his back to the wall and his face toward the door. The second man arrived later, a portly ship owner with flushed red hands, and a laugh louder than it needed to be, and he laughed through the first 15 minutes, all by himself. The man in the gray coat didn't laugh once. Delaney brought out the water. She poured for the ship owner first, then moved around to the other side of the table, and as she tilted the pitcher over the gray-coated man's glass, the sleeve of her uniform, the long sleeve she wore all year, even in July, slipped up about 3/4 of an inch. Only 3/4 of an inch, less than 2 seconds. She tugged it down with her little finger, a movement so small she was no longer conscious of making it, something she had done thousands of times until it had become part of the act of pouring water. And the man in the gray coat stopped chewing. He didn't look up. He didn't say anything. Only his jaw became still for a single beat, the kind of beat no one in the world should have noticed, and then it began moving again. Delaney set down the pitcher and turned away, and she thought nothing of it, because for 3 years no one had noticed anything about her at all. The meal lasted longer than she expected. The shipowner talked and talked and talked, and every time she passed the table she caught another fragment. Something about containers, something about sailing schedules, something about a man named Halloran, and with every round his voice grew a little quieter, until it was no longer louder than it needed to be. The man in the gray coat said almost nothing. He ate slowly, drank less than 1 full glass, and whenever Delaney glanced over, he was looking out the window, where there was nothing but a streetlight and the brick wall across the road. When they rose to leave, the shipowner shook his hand twice and didn't look him in the eyes once. Marge prepared the check at the counter. Delaney watched her draw a pencil through one line on the bill, the line for the bottle of wine, without saying a word, and the man in the gray coat watched her cross it out and said nothing either. He left a bill beneath the candle holder, folded once in half, and walked to the door. Delaney went to clear the table. She stacked the plates on her tray, gathered the glasses, and when she lifted his napkin, folded into a sharp-edged square instead of crumpled like the napkins of nearly everyone else in the world, there was a business card underneath. It was white, thick, and borderless. There was no name, no company, no title, no logo. Only a string of numbers printed in the exact center in small black lettering. Delaney turned it over. The back was blank. She stood there in the empty diner, holding the napkin in one hand, staring at those numbers for about 3 seconds, then slipped the card into her apron pocket beside several crumpled receipts and a pen that had run out of ink, and carried the tray of dishes into the kitchen. 2 nights later, on that fateful Friday when the rain poured against the windows of the copper lantern, the storm finally broke. When Bradley grabbed her wrist in the middle of the diner, Delaney felt the cold weight of Gus's business card still tucked inside her apron pocket. When Gus finally spoke, the spell of Bradley's control was shattered. The fingers released her wrist one by one, slowly, as though each of them had to be given an upward command before it would let go, and the first thing Delaney Whitfield felt wasn't relief. It was fear. Because in 3 years, not once had he ever released her because someone told him to. He let go when he was finished. He let go when he had counted enough. Her wrist was still warm where he had been holding it, and that warmth was now the most frightening thing in the room, because it meant a rule had just been broken, and Delaney had lived inside that rule long enough to know that when one rule broke, whatever replaced it was always worse. The second man stepped forward from behind, someone she had never seen decent enter the diner, broad-shouldered, with reddish hair gone gray at the temples, and he bent close to Bradley Kessler's ear. Delaney couldn't hear a word. No one in the diner could hear a word. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and then he straightened again and brushed at his sleeve as though he had touched dust. Bradley's face went white, not gradually. All at once, like a curtain being torn down, and he stepped back half a pace, struck the back of a chair, and he didn't look at her, didn't look at anyone. He looked down at the tiled floor where the 3 shards of glass were still lying. The man at the corner table rose, put on his gray wool coat, and walked toward the door without looking at Bradley again. The way people don't look back at something that has already been dealt with. Delaney followed him outside, not because he called to her, but because she didn't know what else to do, and because she didn't want to remain in that room with 8 tables of customers staring down into their plates. Outside, the rain had grown heavy again. A black car was parked tight against the curb, its taillights casting a red glow across the wet pavement. The man in gray opened the rear door, held it there, and stood beneath the rain without urging her, without speaking. Water ran down the collar of his coat, and he let it. Delaney stood about 2 steps away, still holding the cleaning cloth in both hands, her hair plastered to her forehead, and she looked into the car, at the dark leather seat and the darkness behind it, and she shook her head. "I don't know who you are," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. That surprised her more than anything else. The man in gray watched her for a long moment. In the red glow of the taillights, his face revealed nothing, no disappointment, no anger, no pity. He gave one small nod. "That's right," he said. "You don't." Then he closed the car door. He didn't force her. He didn't say another word. He walked around to the other side, got in, and the car pulled away, its tires cutting through a puddle at the corner, its taillights growing smaller until they disappeared beyond the bend. Delaney stood alone on the sidewalk in the rain. The diner door flew open behind her, and Marguerite Delacroix hurried out, still wearing her apron, still carrying the towel over one shoulder, and she didn't ask whether Delaney was all right, didn't ask what had just happened, didn't say a single word about the man, the car, or Bradley. She pressed a steel-insulated container into Delaney's hands, the one she usually used for broth, still hot enough that Delaney had to shift it from one hand to the other. "If you don't come to work tomorrow morning," Marge said, "I'll come looking for you myself." Then she turned and went back inside. The door closed. The lights in the diner were still glowing, the jazz music was still crackling softly, and the customers at 8 tables were still finishing their dinners. Delaney looked down at the steel container in her hands for a moment. She tucked it beneath one arm, but she couldn't bear to leave Biscuit behind in the freezing storm. She hurried into the dark alley, scooped up the cardboard box with the 3-legged cat tucked safely inside, and cradled it protectively against her chest to shield it from the downpour. Then she pulled up her collar and began to walk, 3 miles north of Fairmount. Rain poured over her shoulders, soaked through her uniform, ran into her shoes, and she counted the street lights, 1, 2, 3, 4, as she always did, and she walked toward the second-floor apartment in the red brick building, toward the bottom drawer, and the blue-covered ledger inside it, because that was the place she knew. And when a woman had learned how to live inside a cage, the cage was no longer merely the place that imprisoned her. It was the only place in the world where she knew in advance what was going to happen. She heard the drill before she saw the building. A brief shriek, then silence, then the shriek again, the sound of metal biting into wood, drifting down from the second floor through the rain that was slowly thinning. Delaney Whitfield stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up. The apartment door stood wide open. The hallway light was on, and on the landing, kneeling on one knee before the door, was a man in an orange windbreaker with an open toolbox beside him, fastening a new lock into place. On the porch, arranged in a neat row beneath the awning, were 3 cardboard boxes. She recognized her sweater folded on top of the first box, the gray sweater she had bought at the thrift store on Girard Street. She climbed the steps. They were slippery, and she gripped the iron railing, while Marge's steel container remained tucked beneath her arm, still warm. The workman looked up. He was about 50, with a gray beard, and when he saw her, his expression changed, the way a man's face changes when he realizes he do the one thing he has spent the entire day hoping he wouldn't have to do. Are you Miss Kessler?" he asked. "Whitfield," she said. He blinked. "Sorry. The paperwork says Kessler." He stood, wiped his hands on his pant legs, and took a sheet of paper folded into quarters from the pocket of his windbreaker. He didn't hand it over at once. He held it for a moment, and Delaney saw him glance toward the 3 cardboard boxes, and she understood that he was the one who had arranged them there, and that he had arranged them more carefully than the job required. "The new owner takes possession today," he said. "I'm only here to change the lock. I don't know anything else." She took the paper. It was only 1 page, printed on thin paper, with a purple stamp in the lower corner. Date of transfer. She read that line 3 times. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. She stood on the landing and counted backward in her mind. This Friday, the Friday before, the Friday before that. And she remembered that on that Friday Bradley Kessler had come home carrying a box of fried chicken and a bottle of cheap wine, and he had told her to sit down and eat with him, and he had asked about her day at work, and she had lied and said it was fine because she didn't know what he wanted to hear. He had eaten all 4 pieces of chicken. He had laughed. 3 weeks ago, he had sold the apartment and come home to eat fried chicken with her. "What about me?" she asked. The workman looked down at his toolbox. "You should ask someone who knows the law." "I don't." She sat down on the top step. She hadn't meant to sit. Her legs simply stopped standing, and she lowered herself onto the wet concrete, the paper in one hand, the steel container in the other, and stared at the fender of a car across the street. The workman gathered his tools. He finished installing the lock, tested it twice, and before he left, he placed a small plastic umbrella against the wall beside her without saying anything. Then he went down the steps and walked to his truck. Delaney remained there. She thought about the loan. She thought about it very slowly, like someone searching for the next stair in the dark. The previous summer, Bradley had spread a stack of papers across the dining table, handed her a pen, and told her they were insurance documents that she should sign wherever he had made a pencil mark. She had signed. She always signed. For 3 years she had signed everything he placed in front of her, tax forms, bank documents, name change papers, and she had never read a single line, because reading was something done by people who had the right to refuse, and she had left that right somewhere along the road, long before she realized she had dropped it. Now she understood that inside a file drawer, beneath some debt, while the apartment had a new owner, and the man who sold it was somewhere tonight in a place she didn't know. And all he had left her were 3 cardboard boxes, and a name on paperwork she would spend the rest of her life paying for. She thought about calling someone. She sat on the steps and truly thought about it, moving through every name in her mind one by one, and she reached the end of them in less than half a minute, because there were no names at all. No mother, no sister, not a single friend who hadn't quietly fallen away over the past 3 years, because Delaney never called back, never showed up, never explained. The rain stopped completely. Inside the damp cardboard box she had shielded so carefully during her 3-mile walk, the cat with 3 legs shifted once and went back to sleep. No one came. No car pulled over. No one passed by. The entire street was dark and soaked and silent, and Delaney Whitfield, 27 years old, sat on the steps of a home that was no longer hers, with nowhere left to go. She reached into her apron pocket. The receipts had dissolved into pulp. The pen had no ink, and there was a thick white business card, water wrinkled at one corner, with nothing but a string of numbers printed in the exact center. She stared at it for a long time. Then she took out her phone and pressed the numbers one by one. The container sat in the outermost row of the Delaware port. Its doors opened toward the river, and inside there was nothing but 2 plastic chairs and a single light bulb hanging from a wire that ran out to a generator. August Riordan sat at one of the chairs, his gray wool coat draped across his knees, drinking coffee from a lidded paper cup. The coffee had come from a gas station on Columbus Boulevard. The cheapest kind they sold, and he drank it slowly, one small sip at a time, watching the black water beyond the doors, where a barge was moving upriver against the current. About 3 steps away from him, Halloran stood. No one had told Halloran to stand. No one had told him to sit, either. The second plastic chair was right there, within arm's reach, and Halloran looked at it 4 times during the first half hour, but never once dared pull it out. Outside came the grinding of cranes, the blast of ship horns, the warning chimes of trucks backing up, and inside the container there was nothing at all except the sound of Gus drinking his coffee. Halloran waited. He had prepared Jay's speech. He had lain awake the previous night composing it, giving it an opening, an explanation, a place where he would apologize, and another where he would offer to return everything. But a man couldn't deliver a rehearsed speech to someone who asked no questions. He tried once. "Mr. Riordan, what I want to say is," and Gus didn't interrupt him, didn't look at him, didn't do anything at all. And the sentence died halfway through, because there was nothing for it to hold on to. After that, Halloran tried again. He stood there with sweat running down his spine, even though the container was cold, and he began to understand that this wasn't a conversation. It was a bill being drawn up. When the coffee was gone, Gus put the lid back on, set the cup on the container floor, and rose. He brushed the backs of his hands down both trouser legs, once on each side, then put on his coat. "Your daughter goes to Villanova," he said. Halloran didn't move. "This semester's tuition has already been paid. I paid it." That was when Halloran's face went white, not when he heard the name of the school, but when he heard those final 2 words, because those words told him exactly how far this man could reach. And once he understood how far this man could reach, he knew there was nothing left in the world he could keep for himself. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Tomorrow morning, you resign," Gus said in the same voice people used to read the weather forecast. "You move away. The girl finishes all 4 years and never learns what her father once did. That's a gift. Don't make me give it twice." Then he walked out, and Phineas Odell followed him, and the container doors remained open, and Halloran was still standing in the same place when the black car rolled away from the dock. Inside the car, Gus wiped his hands with a paper napkin, folded it, and took out his phone. The first call lasted less than 2 minutes. He listened more than he spoke. Bradley Kessler, 33 years old, a middle manager at an insurance company on Market Street, had spent the previous 18 months taking money from 3 client escrow accounts, routing it through an account in his own name, and using it to cover a gambling debt at a casino across the river in Jersey. Gus didn't ask how much. He asked for the name of the person who had approved the transfers. The second call lasted 20 seconds. "Send it to internal audit. Don't send it to the police." Internal audit. On the third call, he let the phone ring 4 times before the other person answered, and the moment a voice came over the line, Gus spoke over it. "Kessler. 32,000. Stop collecting from him. I've paid it." The person on the other end said something. Gus looked out the window at the port warehouses, sliding backward, gray, wet, indistinguishable from one another. "Now he owes me," he said, and ended the call. The car crossed the bridge with Finn driving, and for a long while Finn said nothing. Then he spoke. "Why didn't you let them keep collecting from him?" Gus continued, looking out the window. "Because I want to wake up every morning and remember who owns him." Finn glanced into the rearview mirror. "A creditor only takes the money," Gus said. "I take what remains." Finn asked nothing more, because he had stood beside this man for 10 years, and he knew that voice, the calm voice that never rose or fell. And he knew that half an hour earlier, the same voice had spoken into a ship owner about his daughter's tuition, and that in the mind of the man sitting in the back seat, there was no difference between the 2 things. One man had stolen his cargo. Another had seized a woman by the wrist in the middle of a restaurant. Both were things that had been placed where they didn't belong, and Gus Riordan had put them back in order during the same afternoon, from the same car, in the same voice, not out of compassion. Out of order, the house in Chestnut Hill was built of gray stone, with walls nearly 1.5 feet thick, and it had 12 rooms, though Delaney Whitfield had entered no more than 4 of them. They gave her a room in the east wing, with windows overlooking a row of oak trees, and inside it stood a large bed covered in white sheets, stretched so smooth they looked like the surface of still water. On the first night, she stood staring at it for a long time. Then she took a blanket from the closet, spread it across the wooden floor beside the foot of the bed, and lay down there. In the morning, she folded the blanket, put it back in the closet, and smoothed the sheet until it was flat again, though no one had touched it in the first place. She did the same thing on the second night. Then on the third. The bed was too clean. She couldn't think of any better reason than that. It was clean in the way something seems clean, when it was waiting for someone worthy of it. And over the past 3 years, Delaney had learned that when you lay yourself down on something you hadn't paid for, sooner or later someone would decide what you owed for the privilege. On the first morning, August Riordan passed her open bedroom door and saw the suitcase. It sat in the corner beside the wardrobe, brown, its leather handle worn smooth with age. The lid was open about a handspan, just wide enough for him to see the clothes inside, arranged in neat square layers, every folded edge as straight as it would have been in a store. Beside it stood a wardrobe that reached almost to the ceiling, with 8 empty drawers and doors left slightly open, untouched. He didn't understand. He stood there for 3 seconds and continued thinking she simply hadn't had demand time and forgot about it. A week later, the suitcase was still in the same place. 2 weeks later, it hadn't moved. The housekeeper replaced the towels, vacuumed the hallway, carried away the laundry, and brought it back, and the clean clothes were folded into the suitcase again, not placed in the wardrobe, and she didn't ask why because she was paid not to ask. By the 3rd week, Gus stopped in the doorway. Delaney was sitting on the floor beside the suitcase, folding a stack of shirts, and she looked up. "Is the drawer broken?" he said. It wasn't a question. He said it the way a man spoke when he had spent his entire life encountering only problems could be solved by calling someone to repair them. "No," she said. He looked at the wardrobe, then at the suitcase. Then why? Delaney set the stack of shirts down. She considered whether she should lie. She had become very good at lying over the past 3 years. She kept an entire drawer of harmless answers ready inside her, and she took one out, placed it on the tip of her tongue, then put it away again, because the room was too strange, and this man was too strange, and she was too tired. "If you unpack," she said, "you'll start believing you're allowed to stay. Then it'll hurt more when you have to leave." Then she lowered her head and continued folding the shirts. Gus said nothing. He remained in the doorway for another moment, and she didn't look up again, and eventually he walked away. 7 houses. 11 years. Not one of them had kept her through more than 2 winters. She had never said that sentence to anyone, and she didn't say it to him, and perhaps she would never say it to anyone for the rest of her life, because it wasn't a story. It was only arithmetic. She lowered the suitcase lid. She pressed the 2 locks shut, click, click, and pushed it against the foot of the wardrobe, and there it remained, closed and ready, exactly as it had always remained. The Second Morning Center occupied a renovated old church in Germantown, and they took Delaney Whitfield on as a volunteer 2 afternoons a week after. She filled out an application exactly 1 page long, which she read from beginning to end twice before signing. Her place was in the kitchen, washing vegetables, chopping onions, peeling potatoes. The task her hands already knew how to do without asking her mind to take part, and no one there asked where she had come from, because it was the kind of place where a question like that was considered impolite. The backyard of the center faced west, with a large maple tree and a wooden porch running the entire width of the building, and on pleasant afternoons nearly everyone went outside to sit there. Delia Holt was 8 years old, the daughter of a woman who worked in the records department, and every afternoon after school, she was dropped off with a yellow backpack and sat doing her homework on the porch until her mother finished work. She was the most talkative child Delaney had ever met. She talked to her backpack, talked to the ant crawling along the railing, talked to herself, and whenever Delaney carried out a basket of beans and sat on the porch steps to string them, Delia immediately began talking to her instead, without any need to warm up, as though the 2 of them had simply paused in the middle of a conversation the week before. That afternoon, she hadn't brought homework. She had brought a stack of square-colored paper and spread the sheets into a fan across the wooden boards between them. "Do you know how to fold a crane?" she asked. "No," Delaney said. The girl stared at her with the expression of someone who had just heard astonishing news. "You really don't?" "I really don't, then I'll teach you," Delia said, with the firm certainty of someone who had just decided how the entire afternoon would be spent, and she pushed an orange sheet toward her. She taught slowly. She taught as someone teaches a child younger than herself, with more patience than the task required, repeating each step twice. Fold it in half, open it, fold it diagonally, open it. Now press this part inward. Delaney's first crane tore at the neck. The second wouldn't stand, and lay on its side across the wooden boards, like something the wind had knocked over. On the third, she made a mistake near the beginning, and by the end, it had become some shape with 4 wings and no head. And Delia picked it up, turned it around, studied it with great seriousness, then set it down and said, "This one, I don't know what to do with." By the 4th, Delaney had begun pressing too hard and wrinkling the paper. The 5th, then the 6th. The afternoon sun sank lower and moved across the yard, reaching the porch and warming the surface of the boards. Someone laughed inside the kitchen. Delaney nearly finished the 7th crane, but the wings came out uneven, one rising much higher than the other, and she held it in her hands and saw that 2 of her fingers were trembling. And she placed it down very gently and said, "I don't think my hands are made for this." Delia disagreed. Without saying a word, she pushed a blue sheet toward her and waited. Delaney looked at the paper. Then she picked it up, folded in half, open it, fold it diagonally, open it. She moved more slowly than she had during all 7 attempts before, and at one point she'd stopped for a long time at the step she had ruined twice, and Delia didn't remind her. The girl simply sat there watching, both hands resting on her knees. Delaney sharpened the final crease with her thumbnail. Then she pulled the 2 wings apart. The crane stood. It stood on the wooden board in the strip of sunlight, leaning slightly to one side, but it stood. And Delia Holt clapped her hands once and burst into laughter, the bright sound of a child breaking open so suddenly that several birds lifted from the maple tree. "See," she cried. "I told you that you could do it." Delaney picked up the crane. It was so light it seemed to weigh almost nothing. She sat there on the sun-warmed wooden porch, holding it in the palm of her hand, and she couldn't say anything at all. The blue paper crane stood on the windowsill in her room for 3 days before Delaney Whitfield carried it downstairs, because she wanted to place it somewhere the afternoon sunlight could reach. And there was a low table beside a large window in the West Wing hallway. She walked barefoot across the wooden floor, with the crane in her hand, and the house was so quiet that she could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the entrance hall below. Study was at the end of the corridor. Its door stood open about a handspan. She hadn't meant to stop. She had passed that door nearly 20 times during the past 3 weeks, and had never stopped once, because it was his room, and she had lived long enough to know which rooms belonged to her and which ones didn't. But this time there was a voice inside, and she heard it, and her feet stopped before her mind had time to decide. She couldn't make out what he was saying. That was the strange part. She didn't hear anyone's name or understand what they were discussing. Only a few fragments drifted through the opening, the name of a street, 2 numbers, the word Thursday. But she could hear the voice, flat, neither rising nor falling. It didn't quicken at any point or slow at another. It was the voice of a man reading the weather report for a cloudy afternoon. Then, clearly, through the narrow opening, came one complete sentence. "Tell him I bought the house he's sleeping in." A silence followed. Inside, a chair turned with a faint creak. "He has until the end of the week." Delaney stood frozen on the wooden floor, the paper crane resting in her hand. She didn't know who was on the other end of the call. She didn't know who the man sleeping in that house was, what he had done, whether he deserved it or didn't. She knew nothing at all, and because she knew nothing, the sentence was even more frightening, because it told her one thing with absolute clarity. The man inside that room could buy the place beneath another man's sleeping body, and he spoke about it in the same voice he used when asking whether she wanted coffee. She stepped back half a pace, and the floorboard creaked. The door opened. August Riordan turned around, the phone still in his hand, and saw her standing in the doorway with the paper crane in her palm. And for one moment before his face softened, before something inside him remembered that he was at home, and that a woman was standing outside his door, Delaney saw what lay beneath. It wasn't anger. It had no name. It was the look of a man calculating what category the object that had just appeared in the doorway belonged to, and how long it would take to put it back where it belonged. It lasted less than a second. Then it disappeared, and he lowered the phone, and he said, "Do you need something?" in his ordinary voice, and his face was the face of the man who had sat across from her at breakfast for 3 weeks without asking her a single question. "No," she said. "I was only passing by." He nodded. His eyes moved once to the crane in her hand, but he didn't ask about it. Then he turned back into the room and closed the door gently, and she heard the lock slide into place, and she remained standing in the hallway for a very long time. She didn't continue to the low table beside the large window. She carried the crane back upstairs and returned it to the windowsill, exactly where it had been, then sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. Outside, the row of oak trees slowly darkened. That night, after the housekeeper's footsteps had faded completely downstairs, and the great stone house held nothing but the ticking of the grandfather clock, Delaney Whitfield rose, walked to her bedroom door and turned the lock. A dry metallic click, the sound of something very small sliding precisely into its proper place. She stood there with her hand still resting on the doorknob and listened to it, and she understood what she was doing, and she left it locked. He had never touched her. He had never raised his voice to her. He had never made her show him how much money she earned, never asked where she was going, never counted anything that belonged to her. During the 3 weeks she had lived in that house, the man hadn't done a single thing wrong to her. But now she knew he could, and the past 3 years had taught her that the distance between could and would was far thinner than people believed, and that any woman who trusted that distance would end up sleeping in the hallway. She went downstairs for water in the deepest part of the night, when even the grandfather clock in the foyer seemed to be counting more slowly, and she walked barefoot without turning on a light because she already knew the way. The kitchen stood at the end of the west wing corridor, a wide room paved in slate with an island as long as the entire room where she had once slept in Fairmount, and when Delaney Whitfield stepped inside, she almost walked past him without seeing him. August Riordan was sitting on the floor with his back against the refrigerator door, his legs stretched out across the cold stone. There were no lights on, only the pale blue glow of the oven clock and the street light slipping through the window above the sink. He wore a dress shirt without a tie, the sleeves rolled up, and in his lap lay the 3-legged cat. Biscuit was curled there in exactly the same position it had always taken, inside the cardboard box behind the diner's trash bins, and its tail flicked once when Delaney stopped in the doorway. He didn't look up. "It's missing a leg, and it still climbed into my lap," he said. His voice was rough, lower than it was during the day, and it didn't have the flatness of the voice she had heard through the crack in the study door. "Can you explain that?" Delaney stood there. Outside, a car passed along Germantown Avenue. Then everything was quiet again. "It doesn't know it's missing one," she said. He didn't answer. His hand rested on the cat's back, not stroking it, simply lying there, while the cat breathed evenly beneath his palm. She remained in the doorway for a long time, longer than she intended, long enough for her feet to grow numb against the stone floor. Then she turned and went back upstairs. She never got the water. Nothing happened at all. The next morning, sunlight fell at an angle through the dining room windows, and Gus was reading something on his tablet when Delaney set down her coffee cup and said, "I'm back to work at the diner." He didn't look up immediately. He finished reading the line in front of him. Then he set the tablet down. "There's no need," he said. "You don't have to work anymore." It was the kindest answer a man could have given, spoken in the voice of someone lifting a burden from another person's shoulders, and 3 weeks earlier Delaney would have lowered her head and said nothing. But the previous night, she had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched a man sitting in the darkness with an animal no one wanted resting in his lap, and all morning she had carried that image inside her like a warm coal, and so she continued. "You don't understand," she said. "I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you." He looked at her. He lifted his glass of orange juice and said, in that calm voice that neither rose nor fell, "It isn't safe out there. Silence." Somewhere in the house, the housekeeper opened a door and closed it again. Birds called from the garden. Delaney looked down at the table and saw her hand resting there, saw that wrist, and in the space of 3 breaths, she walked through 3 years of her life, past the blue-covered ledger, and the locked door and the suit secured inside the closet. And that sentence, the sentence she had heard not once, not 10 times, but over and over, always spoken with this same gentle concern in the second-floor apartment of the red brick building whenever she asked to go somewhere alone. Bradley used to say exactly the same thing, she said, very softly. She wasn't even certain she had spoken aloud until she heard the glass break. The glass in Gus's hand shattered. It didn't fall. It broke inside his palm, and shards of glass and orange juice spilled across the table and onto the rug, while a red line ran over the back of his hand and down into the cuff of his white shirt. He didn't look down. He didn't take his eyes from her, and there was nothing on his face, no anger, no pain. And Delaney sat perfectly still, afraid to breathe, waiting for the thing beneath the surface to rise. It didn't. He sat there with blood dripping onto a Persian rug worth an entire year of her wages, and he didn't say a single word, because there was nothing he could say, because she was right. She had been back at work for 9 days, and on the 9th night, the copper lantern caught fire. The last table had left long ago. The chairs had been turned upside down on the tables. Every light in the dining room had been switched off except for the 2 above the counter, and Delaney Whitfield was outside in the rear alley, crouched beside the blue trash bins, pouring breadcrumbs into her palm. She still came out there every night, even though Biscuit now slept on an armchair in Chestnut Hill. Because there were 2 others in the alley, one a tabby and the other entirely black, and the black one would only eat after she stepped back 3 paces. She heard the explosion before she saw anything. It wasn't loud, just a low thump, the sound of something exhaling, and then orange light leaped across the brick wall on the opposite side of the alley, and the hallway light inside the diner went out. She sprang to her feet, spilling all the crumbs onto the pavement, ran to that back door, seized the handle, and pulled, but it didn't move. She struck the door twice with her entire arm. "Marge," a sound answered from inside. She couldn't make out the words, but there was a voice, and then something fell. The diner's back door was made of steel, opened outward, and hung on 3 hinges, and it had been bent since the previous winter, when the delivery boy backed his truck into the frame. Everyone in the kitchen knew about it. You had to kick the bottom of the door before it would open. Delaney kicked it. The door shifted up a crack, then jammed, and smoke burst through the opening, thick and black, and she began coughing and turned her face away. She looked around the alley. She had stood in that alley nearly 1,000 evenings, and she knew everything that was in it. She ran to the iron rack bolted to the wall beside the door, tore the red fire extinguisher from its bracket, and it was heavier than she expected and nearly slipped from her hands. She didn't spray it. She gripped it with both hands and slammed its base into the lowest hinge. Once, metal struck metal, the sound ricocheting between the alley walls. Twice the hinge shifted. 3 times. It broke loose and the steel door sagged downward, and she drove her shoulder into it and it swung wide open. Smoke rolled out and swallowed her. She dropped low, almost flat against the ground. Because when she was 15, a man had taught her to do that during a school fire drill, and she had never forgotten, and she crawled inside. The kitchen was blind with smoke. She couldn't see anything except an orange glow at the far end, near the preparation area, near the old electrical panel that made the entire row of lights flicker whenever the second oven was turned on. She called Marge's name. A cough came from the left, low to the floor, beside the kitchen island, and Delaney crawled toward it until her hand touched an apron. Marguerite Delacroix lay on her side on the tile, one hand still gripping the leg of the island, trying to drag herself forward but unable to move. Delaney slid both arms beneath her shoulders. She was heavy, heavier than anything Delaney had ever lifted in her life, and Delaney pulled, moving backward 1 heel at a time across tiles slick with water and grease, 1 step then another, while the smoke pressed lower and lower, and she couldn't remember how far she had dragged her. She only remembered that at some point cold air struck the back of her neck, and she knew they had reached the alley, and she kept pulling, another 30 feet into the middle of the alley, away from the doorway, until her back struck a trash bin and she collapsed onto the wet pavement with Marge resting against her body. Only then came the sirens. Only then came the trucks. Only then came the people. The black car braked hard at the mouth of the alley, and August Riordan was out before it had fully stopped, and he saw the smoke pouring from the steel door hanging crookedly from a single hinge, and he ran toward it. Phineas O'Dell caught him on the 3rd step. Finn didn't say anything. He simply wrapped one arm across Gus's chest and held him back, and Gus struggled once, violently, then went still, his hand closing around Finn's sleeve and remaining there. The fire engine light swept across his face, red, then dark, then red again, and he stood there staring toward the doorway without taking another step. The paramedics brought out a stretcher. They placed Marge on it, covered her with a blanket, and fitted an oxygen mask over her face, but she pushed it away with 2 fingers. She reached out blindly, and Delaney took her hand, and Marge squeezed, that hand hardened by 40 years of kitchen smoke, as solid as wood. "I came out through your door," Marge said. Her voice was raw, but every word was clear, and her eyes weren't on Delaney. They were fixed on the entrance to the alley, where the man in the gray wool coat stood beneath the sweeping red lights. Not his. The report was 4 pages long, and the city fire investigator signed his name on the final page, and what it said was simple enough to be almost absurd. The electrical wiring behind the wall in the preparation area had been installed when the building was still a laundromat. The insulation had decayed into powder, and the breaker panel had been overloaded for years. The same panel everyone in the kitchen knew would make the row of ceiling lights whenever the second oven was switched on. There was no accelerant, no sign of forced entry, nothing at all. It was a pure accident, the kind of accident waiting to happen in roughly 400 other old buildings across Philadelphia on that very same night, and it had chosen that building, on that night, for no reason whatsoever. Phineas O'Dell read it twice in the car before carrying it upstairs. Gus Riordan was standing at the study window with his back turned, both hands clasped behind him, and the back of his right hand was still bandaged from the glass he had shattered the other day. Finn placed the 4 pages on the desk. "Old wiring," Finn said. "A short inside the rear wall. No one did anything." Gus didn't turn around. "Have you read it?" "I have." "You should read it." Gus turned. He looked down at the papers on the desk, but he didn't reach for them, didn't bend over them, and for 3 seconds Finn thought he might actually read them. "Reports can be bought," Gus said. Then he walked out of the room. And from that moment forward, for 6 days, the city of Philadelphia witnessed something it hadn't witnessed in 6 years. A warehouse in South Philadelphia was entered before dawn, and by the time its owner arrived, there was nothing left for him to unlock. A pawn shop on Passaic Avenue closed indefinitely, and its owner flew to Florida within 48 hours, and no one was able to reach him again. A refrigeration contractor in Kensington, a man with 3 grandchildren and not a single enemy in the world, was summoned somewhere and returned home without saying a word to his wife, and the following week he put his company up for sale. A woman who kept the books for a transportation company on Delaware Avenue was asked questions no one should ever have been asked very politely, very calmly, by men with endless patience, and she had done nothing wrong. And she knew she had done nothing wrong, and that acknowledged nothing to help her during those 2 hours. No one was beaten. That was the detail people mentioned later, when they told the story in the bars along the river. Not one person was beaten. There were only doors opened, names read aloud, debts called due all at once, telephone calls made before dawn, and a city seemed to shrink by another inch every day. And during those for the first 6 years, August Riordan left traces behind him. A license plate caught on a gas station camera. A call placed from a number that should never have been used for such a purpose. A name spoken aloud in a room with 3 people, when 3 people were already too many. For 6 years he had moved through the city without touching a single pane of glass, and now he moved like a man walking through mud. Finn saw all of it. Finn drove the car. Finn stood at the door. Finn made the calls he didn't want to make, and every night Finn went home and sat in his car inside his own garage for a long time before going into the house. Because Finn had read those 4 pages. Finn knew there was no one. No enemy behind the fire, no warning, no one trying to send anyone a message. There was only a copper wire as old as his grandfather, rotting inside a wall, and one night it touched another wire. The man Finn had subsided for 10 years was hunting someone who didn't exist, and with every step he took in pursuit of that person, he left another footprint behind. And somewhere in the city there were people whose entire life's work was to bend down and study footprints exactly like those. Finn had placed 4 pages on the desk. The 4 pages remained there untouched for 3 straight days, until the housekeeper put them away. The garage lay beneath the stone house, 3 bays wide with a low ceiling. and it smelled of concrete and motor oil and the cold of stone that had never seen the sun. August Riordan sat on a metal stool beside the workbench, and on the surface before him lay a sheet printed from a computer, a list of telephone calls, with one number highlighted in yellow on the 11th line. Phineas O'Dell stood 4 steps away with his hands in the pockets of his coat, and he didn't look at the paper because he didn't need to. "You're not going to ask whether it was me," Finn said. "I don't need to ask, then I'll tell you," Finn said. "It was me, somewhere above them inside the house." Footsteps crossed the floor and faded away. Gus remained seated. He didn't look at Finn. He looked at the bench vise bolted to the corner of the workbench, the vise that had been there since his father's time, its handle worn smooth and polished. "How much?" Gus said. "It was no amount. Who paid you? No one paid me." "Then tell me why." Finn didn't answer at once. He took his hands from his pockets and stood there with both arms hanging at his sides, and he said, "Because you're walking straight toward your death, and you aren't looking where you put your feet. 6 days. Do you know how much you've left behind during the past 6 days? I do. I've been cleaning up after you. I found 5. I couldn't get the 6th because it was already sitting on someone else's server." He drew a breath. "I'd rather see you go to prison than stand beside a grave and listen to people say kind things about you." Gus rose. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't say anything. He simply stood from the metal stool and stepped forward, once, then twice, and the garage was cold and silent, and there was nothing at all in his hands, and Finn stepped back. It happened before Finn had time to decide. His whole body did it. His heels, his knees, his shoulders. That body somewhere in the 130-pound range that had stood beside this man for 10 years, had covered him, had driven for him, had shared breakfast with him in nameless diners on mornings. No one wanted to remember. And that body moved backward 1 step across the concrete floor, the sole of his shoe giving a brief, sharp squeal in the garage. Gus stopped. He stood between the 2 vehicle bays and looked down. He didn't look at Finn. He looked at his right hand, the hand still wrapped in bandages, held open, with every finger extended completely empty. He stared at it for a long time, as though it were some foreign object someone had attached to his wrist while he slept. "Do you know what you just did?" Finn said. His voice was quiet. "You made me step back." Gus didn't raise his head. "Your father made me step back once too," Finn said. "I was 19. Neither man spoke. Above them, the grandfather clock in the foyer struck once, then fell silent. "Listen to me," Finn said. "You aren't protecting her. You're turning her into the reason you become your father. You hadn't broken anything in 6 years, and now you've broken 3 places in 6 days because of an old electrical panel. You aren't doing that for her. She doesn't even know about it. You're doing it for someone else, and that person isn't here anymore, and you know exactly who I mean." Gus continued staring at his hand. Then he closed it. Then he opened it again. Then he let it fall to his side. He lifted his head and looked at Finn. And there was nothing in that look like the thing Delaney Whitfield had seen in the doorway of the study. Nothing calculating, nothing deciding where an object belonged and how to put it back into place. There was only a 34-year-old man standing in his father's garage. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. In 10 years, Phineas O'Dell had never seen something without finishing it. Not once. Not a telephone call. Not a sentence. Not a single step. Gus turned away. He walked past the workbench, past the printed page with the 11th line highlighted in yellow, and he didn't pick it up, and he climbed the stairs, leaving Finn alone in the cold garage with both hands hanging at his sides and the mark on the concrete where his heel had just slid backward. He waited for her in the parking lot of the Second Morning Center, leaning against an unremarkable gray sedan, and when Delaney Whitfield came outside, he raised an identification card to the level of his face and held it there until she had finished reading it. "Raymond Shaw, United States Attorney's Office, Eastern District of Pennsylvania." He was about 45, wore a navy blue tie, and had the look of a man who hadn't slept enough in years but had grown so accustomed to it that it no longer bothered him. 15 minutes, he said. "We can do it here. We can do it in the car. You choose." They sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks down, the kind with plastic tables and a menu written in chalk, and he ordered nothing. He placed a leather briefcase on the chair beside him, opened it, took out a thin file folder with a blue cover, and slid it across the table toward her. "Read it," he said. "I'm not going to explain." Delaney opened the cover. The first page was an intake report. A name appeared on the line marked Declarant, Bradley Robert Kessler, a date, a location. Beneath that were 4 typed lines summarizing the interview, a signature in the corner, and beside the signature, a round official stamp. She read it again from the beginning. Then she turned to the second page, and the second page was a form with a bold title printed across the center, and among the dense lines of legal language was a phrase stamped diagonally in red, and the phrase was federal witness. She stared at it for a long time. Beyond the window, a bus stopped and pulled away. "He came to us on his own," Raymond Shaw said. "No one contacted him." Delaney didn't look up. "I've been doing this for 19 years, he said. "People come to me for 2 reasons, because of money or because they're trapped. Your husband didn't ask for money." She understood before he finished speaking. She sat at that plastic table and saw the entire shape of it reveal itself all at once, clean and complete, like a door sliding perfectly into its lock. Bradley no longer owed the casino. Bradley didn't owe the bank, didn't owe the landlord, didn't owe anyone at all. Bradley owed only one person in the entire world, and there was no way to repay him, no way to run, and only one door leading out of that room. The man who had gripped her wrist in front of 8 tables of customers was now sitting somewhere with air conditioning and bottled water, and the United States government was keeping him safe. Raymond Shaw took out a second file. This one was thicker. Its cover had yellowed around the edges, and a number had been affixed to the upper corner, with a paper label that had peeled halfway off, the kind of label placed on things that had been sitting in a drawer for a very long time. He didn't slide it across the table. He set it down in front of her and opened it for her to a particular page, then withdrew his hand. The page held a diagram, a stretch of road, a median, an arrow. The date in the upper right corner was from 3 years earlier. Beneath the diagram was a table, and one line in that table recorded the result of a blood alcohol test, and beside it was a number followed by an abbreviation Delaney didn't understand. But she didn't need to understand it, because in the notes column beside it were 3 typed words: operator of vehicle. And the name beside those in 3 words wasn't hers. She stopped breathing. Raymond Shaw turned one page, only one. And this page she knew. She knew it immediately, before her eyes had time to read it, because she recognized the handwriting on the final line. It was hers. It was her signature trembling, the last curve trailing beneath the ruled line, the date written beside it, and above it was a 17-word typed sentence stating that the undersigned confirmed she had been operating the vehicle at the time of the collision. In the right margin, inside a small spot, there was one line from the hospital, only one, and Delaney read it, and it contained only 2 words she remembered: permanent injury. She sat without moving for a very long time. Beyond the window, another bus stopped. She thought of a hospital room 3 years earlier, and a 29-year-old man kneeling beside her bed and crying, truly crying. Crying so hard his shoulders shook, telling her he would lose everything, telling her he would go to prison, telling her there was no one else in the world who could help him but her. She had been 24. She had passed through 7 homes in 11 years, and not once, not a single time in her life, had anyone ever told her they needed her. She had taken the pen. She hadn't read the paper. She never read anything. "Miss Kessler," Raymond Shaw said, and his voice wasn't cruel, which was the worst part. It sounded almost tired. "I need Riordan. I don't need you. You take the stand. You say he coerced you. You say he kept you inside his house, and you walk out of that courtroom with clean hands." He tapped 2 fingers against the yellowed file. "You refuse. And I use this, making false statements to investigators. 3 years ago, you had a reason, but a reason isn't a legal defense, and I'll put this before a jury, and I'll win, Miss Kessler." Delaney looked down at her signature on the page. She stared at it for a long time. Then she said, very softly, "Whitfield." He looked up. "My name is Whitfield." The rain began while she was still in the center's kitchen, and by the time she locked the back door and stepped into the parking lot, it had become a dense, vertical rain, the kind that reduced the entire city to the circle of light beneath each street lamp. Second morning's parking lot sat behind the old church, its asphalt cracked, grass growing through the seams, and it had only one tall security light near the gate, about 30 yards from where Delaney Whitfield was standing. He stepped out from between 2 cars. Laney, she froze. 3 years in a second-floor apartment had taught her body to do that before her mind had time to object, and she stood there with her keys in one hand, rain streaming down her face, unable to move. Bradley Kessler had grown thinner. His shirt clung to his body, his hair lay plastered across his forehead, and he carried nothing. Both hands hung open at his sides where she could see them. "I only want to talk," he said. Then he dropped to his knees. Right there on the wet asphalt in the middle of the parking lot, both knees striking the ground, he tilted his face up toward her and began to cry. Not the kind of crying meant for someone to watch. His shoulders shook. His breath broke between the words. His tears mixed with the rain and ran from his chin, and he didn't wipe them away. "I ruined everything," he said. I know I did. I can't sleep. I don't have anything anymore. No home. I'm sleeping on an old classmate's couch, and I'm 33 years old, Laney." 33. He dragged one hand across his face. "You're the only person who ever put up with me. You were the only one." And Delaney stood there, and something inside her stepped forward. Not her feet. Something deeper. Something that had been trained for 3 years until it had become a reflex, like pulling a hand away from a hot stove, and it wanted to move toward him. It wanted to kneel beside him. It wanted to place a hand on his shoulder and say it was all right. It wanted to say she was sorry. Sorry for leaving. Sorry for making him sit there in the rain. And that part of her was so strong that she felt the weight of her body shift slightly forward, and that was the most terrible moment of Delaney Whitfield's entire life. Worse than the ledger. Worse than the lock. Worse than the 3 cardboard boxes on the porch. Because she almost believed him. She closed her eyes for one beat. Then she stepped back once, then twice. And Bradley stood. He rose quickly and cleanly, brushed off both knees, and his face changed in less than a second, the tears switching off as though someone had flipped a switch, and the man standing before her now was the man she had lived with for 3 years. "You think he loves you," he said. His voice was dry. "He loves that you need him." Delaney didn't answer, because it was the truest thing he had ever said in his life, and they both knew it. "You went from my drawer to his," he said. "His drawer is just bigger." Then he grabbed her wrist. She kicked him. The heel of her shoe came down hard on the top of his foot, and he folded forward, and she tore her hand free from his loosening fingers, and she ran. Not into the darkness. Not behind the church, not between the rows of cars, not toward the low fence she could have climbed in 6 seconds. She ran toward the security light at the gate. She ran toward the circle of light, toward the road, toward the white camera mounted on the pole beneath the center's sign, the camera she had passed 4 times a week for 8 months without once looking up. She ran toward witnesses. She burst into the middle of the light and turned around and stood there, gasping, rain pouring over her face, both arms hanging at her sides, and she looked straight at him across the parking lot. Bradley didn't follow. He stood in the darkness between 2 cars, his weight on one foot, and he looked at the circle of light and then at the camera on the pole, and he understood, and he didn't take another step. 3 breaths later, tires screamed at the entrance, headlights swept across the lot, and Phineas O'Dell jumped from the car before it had fully stopped. He ran 5 steps, then slowed, because there was nothing left for him to run toward. The woman standing beneath the light didn't need anyone to pull her out of anywhere. She had already placed herself there. The emergency room at Chestnut Hill Hospital was bright white and smelled of rubbing alcohol, and they bandaged her wrist before telling her to sit and wait for her discharge papers. Delaney Whitfield sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her clothes still soaked through, her hair clinging to her neck, while August Riordan stood at the foot of the bed and said nothing for 4 full minutes. Then he took his phone from the pocket of his coat. He didn't press anything. He only held it in his hand, his thumb resting against the glass, and Delaney looked at that thumb and knew exactly what was about to happen, and she knew it would happen cleanly, efficiently, without noise, and that by morning the name Bradley Kessler would become something no one in the city ever mentioned again. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "Don't." He didn't pull away. "If you make him disappear," she said, "I'll never know whether I can stand on my own." He looked at her. In the hallway, the wheels of a cart passed by. Then he returned the phone to his coat pocket. That night, when Phineas O'Dell reached home and sat in his car inside the garage, as he had done for weeks, Delaney stood in the slate-floored kitchen at Chestnut Hill and placed a sheet of paper on the island, weighing it down with the candle holder. She wrote in ballpoint pen, her handwriting neat, and she had written 7 versions before that one and crumpled every one of them, and the 8th contained only 3 sentences. "You gave me a home, I need a life. Don't look for me. Let me find myself first." She carried the suitcase downstairs. It was still closed, still locked, its contents still arranged in neat square layers as they had been for the past 3 years and the past 3 months, and she stood in the foyer holding in one hand, then stopped. On the armchair beside the fireplace, the three-legged cat slept curled into itself, one ear twitching at something inside its dreams. She stood watching it for a long time. Then she walked out the door and didn't take it with her. Gus found the note the following morning. He read it standing up, a cup of coffee still in one hand, and he read it 3 times. Then he set the cup down. Finn arrived close to noon. He didn't ask. He only stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the note on the island, then at the armchair in the foyer, where the cat lay licking its remaining front leg, and then he spoke. "I can find her in half a day." Gus didn't turn around. Beyond the window, the row of oak trees stood perfectly still. "I know," he said. Finn waited. He waited for a long time, longer than Rowood had ever waited for anything during the 10 years he'd stood beside this man, and in the garage beneath their feet, the mark remained on the concrete where his heel had slid backward. Nothing else came. Gus didn't say another word. He stood at the window with both hands clasped behind his back, and on the back of his right hand there was now only a thin scar, and he didn't turn around, and the phone lay on the table, exactly a handspan from his reach, and he didn't touch it. By afternoon, Finn had gone home. By evening, the three-legged cat was still lying in the armchair beside the fireplace, and in the slate-floored kitchen, beneath the candle holder, those 3 sentences remained exactly where she had left them. The room on the 7th floor of the Federal Buildings in Chestnut Street had a long table, 6 chairs, and a window that couldn't be opened, looking out at a concrete wall 4 yards away. August Riordan sat at the head of the table, his gray wool coat draped over the back of his chair, and he had come alone. His attorney sat to his right and said nothing during the first 2 hours, because there was nothing for him to say. Raymond Shaw sat across from them with 2 members of his team and a recording device placed in the exact center of the table, and before him were 4 case files stacked one upon another, and he had been preparing for this day for 6 years. He didn't need 3 of them, Gus confessed. He confessed before Shaw had time to open the first file. Financial extortion, 1 count, with a name, a date, and an account number, and he recited it in the same voice people used to read the weather report, and his attorney placed a hand on his arm once, then withdrew it because there was no point. 2 years. A silence settled over the room, long enough for them to hear the air conditioner running. Raymond Shaw straightened in his chair. He was intelligent enough to know that when an animal walked willingly into a trap, the trap needed to be inspected again, and so he inspected it. He asked the same question 3 times in 3 different ways. Gus didn't change his answer. Gus stated his conditions at the end, when everything was finished and the agreement was being printed. There were 2. Shaw accepted the first immediately, almost before Gus had finished speaking, because it cost him nothing at all. Every file connected to Delaney Whitfield would be closed. Every allegation, every warrant, everything. Shaw crossed out 1 line in his notebook and nodded. He had Riordan now. The woman had only been leverage, and no one kept the lever after the weight had already been lifted. The second condition appeared on page 4, in the final paragraph, a long sentence with nothing remarkable about its wording. The prosecution agreed to transfer the case file for the traffic collision identified by the accompanying number to the appropriate unit for reinvestigation, together with all supplementary evidence provided by the defense. Shaw skimmed it. It had nothing to do with his case. It was a 3-year-old traffic matter in another county. It wouldn't cost him $1 a person or an hour. He signed. Gus signed after him. He set down the pen, put on his coat, and on his way out he didn't look at the recording device. Didn't look at Shaw, didn't look at the window facing the concrete wall. He told no one. He didn't tell Finn, who drove him home and had waited in the car outside for 2 hours and learned nothing beyond 3 words. It is done. He didn't write a letter. He didn't ask anyone to deliver a message. There was a name and a string of numbers he could have found in half a day, and he could have found them during the first week if he had wanted to, and he hadn't wanted to. And it was the only thing in August Riordan's life that he had ever begun without finishing, and this time he had done it deliberately. In Pittsburgh, 5 hours west by car, Delaney Whitfield washed dishes in the kitchen of a diner on Penn Avenue from afternoon until late at night 6 days a week, and rented a room on the 3rd floor of a building without an elevator. The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, a white envelope from the prosecutor's office. She stood at the foot of the stairs and read it 3 times. Every file relating to you has been closed. There was nothing else. No explanation. No name at the bottom except a typed signature. She folded the letter, climbed 3 flights of stairs, and sat on the edge of the bed in her rented room. Then she understood, or believed she understood. A file like that wasn't closed with empty air. It was closed with money, or with a telephone call from someone no one could refuse, and she knew only one person like that in the world. She sat there for a long time with the paper in her hand. She had traveled 5 hours west to stand on her own 2 feet, and he had reached across those 5 hours and lifted her again, cleanly, efficiently, without noise, exactly the way someone lifted an object from the place where it had been set down wrong. She entered the courtroom with an aluminum cane, moving slowly, and she refused the arm the clerk offered her, and it took her nearly a full minute to cross the dozen or so steps from the door to the witness chair. Marguerite Delacroix was 61 years old, dressed in a charcoal cloth coat she wore only to funerals, and she carried a canvas bag. She sat down, leaned the cane against the side of the chair, and placed the bag in her lap. They asked her name. She gave it. They asked her occupation. Cook, she said. 40 years. Her voice had been rough even before the fire, and now it was rougher, but it was clear, and no one needed to tell her to speak louder. The prosecutor asked whether she had brought any documents with her. She opened the canvas bag and took out a ledger. It was thick, its hard cover peeling away at the spine, the edges of the pages curling like dried leaves, with 3 rubber bands wrapped around it to keep it from coming apart. She removed the rubber bands. She placed the ledger on the witness stand, but she didn't open it immediately. She rested one hand on it, the hand hardened by 40 years of kitchen smoke, and looked out across the courtroom. Before I read, she said, "You need to know what this is." Then she opened the first page. She didn't hand it to anyone. She only opened it and looked down, and the paper on that page had faded to the color of tea, while the ink had grown so pale that it had to be tilted toward the light to be read. A date appeared in the upper corner, 20 years earlier, and a name, not Delaney Whitfield's. "I once had a daughter," Marge said. The courtroom fell silent. I didn't write anything down for her, not one word. I thought that if I didn't put it on paper, then it wasn't real. She turned the first page over. She didn't turn another. She closed the ledger and kept her hand resting on the cover. "She died in the winter when she was 26, she said. "After that I wrote. I wrote everything. Who came into my kitchen, what day they came, what they looked like. I don't save anyone. I know I don't save anyone, but I don't let anyone disappear without somebody writing them down." No one spoke. The defense attorney didn't rise. The judge didn't strike the gavel. In the 3rd row, a woman raised one hand to cover her mouth and made no sound. "Now I can read," Marge said. The prosecutor handed her a slip of paper with a date written on it. She didn't need to look at it for long. She opened the ledger, turned the pages, turned again, and found the entry in less than 10 seconds, because she had searched for it many times during the past 3 years. She read directly from the page, in the same voice she used to call orders back to the preparation station. That night, the girl came to work with her right hand bandaged. She stopped. She said she had been driving. She lifted her eyes from the ledger and looked directly toward the table on the left, where Bradley Kessler sat between his 2 attorneys. "She is left-handed," Marge said. The entire courtroom was silent. 3 weeks later, the United States Attorney's Office revoked Bradley Robert Kessler's status as a federal witness and transferred his file to the state prosecutor, and he was charged with 3 offenses, and the first of those 3 offenses bore a deadline 3 years earlier. In Pittsburgh, Delaney Whitfield knew nothing about any of it until someone called and asked whether it had received the subpoena. She said she would come. She traveled alone. She took the train, sat in the last row, and throughout those 5 hours she looked out the window, unaware that somewhere else in the state, a man had signed his name on the 4th page of an agreement, and that his signature was the thing that had opened the case she was about to step into. The diner reopened in the spring, and they kept the old name and the same warped sign, only repainting the vowels and replacing every electrical wire behind the preparation area. Delaney Whitfield stood across Fairmount Street and looked at it for a long time. A sheet of paper had been taped to the front window, handwritten in large letters. "Assistant cook needed. Inquire inside." She read it 3 times. Then she crossed the street and pushed it open the door. The bell above it was still the old one. There were no customers yet, The chairs were still turned upside down on the tables, and the air smelled of fresh paint mixed with frying onions. She walked around the counter and pushed through the sliding door into the kitchen. On the low shelf beside the sink, curled on top of an open sack of flour, the three-legged cat was sleeping. Marguerite Delacroix stood at the stove with her back turned, stirring a pan. She didn't look around. She didn't ask where Delaney had been for the past 8 months. She didn't ask how she had come back, where she had been, or who she had been with. She set down the pan, turned off the flame, and said in that rough voice of hers, "The soup's getting cold." On the kitchen windowsill sat a bowl of soup on a saucer, a spoon, and 3 thick slices of bread. Delaney stood there, unable to move. Then Marge walked with her cane to the small cabinet mounted on the wall, opened it, and took down an envelope. Its edges had yellowed, and there was a round stain in one corner, where someone had once rested a coffee cup. She handed it to Delaney. "This was sent to me," she said. "Not to you. I've kept it for 4 months." Then she returned to the stove, relit the burner, and began stirring the pan again. There was no sender's name on the envelope. Only the diner's name and address, written by hand in small, even black lettering. Inside were 2 photocopied pages. The first was the cover page of a plea agreement, bearing a case number, the name of the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and the name August Riordan. The second was page 4. It contained 2 conditions. The first had been underlined in pencil with 1 thin line, and it stated that every file related to Delaney Whitfield would be closed. The second wasn't underlined. It appeared in the final paragraph of the page, a long sentence in small print, with nothing remarkable about its wording, and it stated that the prosecution agreed to transfer the file for the traffic collision, identified by the accompanying case number, to the appropriate unit for reinvestigation, together with all supplementary evidence provided by the defendant. Delaney read the sentence. Then she read it again. She stood in the cramped kitchen filled with steam, holding the 2 pages, and the whole shape of it revealed itself to her at once, neat and complete, just as it had when she sat at the plastic table with Raymond Shaw. No one had bought anything. There had been no telephone call, no money, no man reaching across 5 hours of distance to lift her, as though she were an object that had been placed where it didn't belong. There had been a man who walked into a room on the 7th floor of the Federal Building on Chestnut Street, sat down, and offered 2 years of his life in exchange for 2 sentences on a page. And the second sentence was the one no one noticed, and the second sentence was the one that opened the file Marge had entered carrying a ledger in her canvas bag. He had gone to prison to open a drawer, and he hadn't told her. He hadn't written her a single word. He had sent it to a 61-year-old cook without including any message at all, and she had kept it for 4 months without opening it. Delaney sat down. She lowered herself onto the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator door, the 2 pages resting in her lap, and she began to cry. At first she cried without sound, then the sound came, and she wrapped her arms around her knees and wept like someone breaking apart. And it was the first time in 3 years that she had cried in front of another person. Marge didn't turn around. She didn't come to her, didn't bend down, didn't place a hand on her shoulder. She stood at the stove stirring the pan, and she let Delaney cry, and on the sack of flour beside the sink, the 3-legged cat opened one eye and went back to sleep. It was released on a June afternoon, and no one was waiting at the gate because he hadn't told anyone the date. He took a bus back to the city. The man who sat beside him for the entire ride had no idea who he was sitting next to, and that was probably the first time in 20 years that such a thing had happened to August Riordan. And Gus looked out the window for the whole journey without saying a word. 3 weeks later, the Copper Lantern received a reservation for 1 person, Friday evening, the corner table by the window if it was available. He arrived exactly on time. The same old gray wool coat, no tie, silver beginning to show at his temples. He sat down with his back to the wall and his face toward the door, and he ordered from the waitress the way everyone else ordered. Delaney Whitfield looked out through the kitchen sliding door and stood there for a long time, then turned back to her pan. He ate slowly. He didn't order wine. He didn't ask for anyone, didn't send a message, didn't request anything. When he finished, he asked for the check, paid by card, and left the tip on the saucer beneath the candle holder folded once in half. He put on his coat and walked toward the door. "Mr. Riordan," he stopped. Delaney stood at the kitchen entrance, still holding a towel, and she spoke louder than necessary because there were still customers in the diner. "I have Tuesdays off." He didn't turn around. He stood with one hand resting on the doorknob, and perhaps only 2 people in the entire diner heard his answer. Morning or afternoon. That summer, the backyard of the Second Morning Center had a large maple tree, and people stretched a line from its lowest branch to the porch roof and hung paper lanterns from it, dozens of them, red and yellow and blue, while 10-year-old Delia Holt stood on the wooden steps, giving instructions in the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Marge baked in the kitchen and refused to let anyone enter, and when the tall man with his shirt sleeves rolled up, carried a tray of pastries into the yard and dropped one into the grass, the entire yard erupted in laughter, the bright burst of children's voices sending every bird in the maple tree into the air, and he bent down to pick it up, and he laughed too. Embroidered in blue thread across the chest of the kitchen uniform worn by the woman standing beside the outdoor oven, wrapped in 2 assistants, was a single name, Delaney Whitfield. Around her neck was a thin chain, and hanging from it was a tiny paper crane sealed inside clear resin, its folds already beginning to yellow. A woman who worked at the center stood beside Marge and looked out over the yard, at the paper lanterns and the children and the man retrieving a pastry from the grass, and she said, "Do you think she was saved?" Marge didn't take her eyes from the oven. "No," she said. "I think she came home on her own. Some people will enter our lives and open a door for us, and we will remain grateful to them for the rest of our days. But no one can take the step across that threshold in our place. Saving someone doesn't mean moving them into a prettier cage than the one they had before. It means giving them back the right to decide what happens to their own life, even when they decide to walk away from us. And a person's worth never lies in what they can produce for someone else. It lies in the simple truth that they exist, that they have a name, a profession, and a Tuesday afternoon that belongs entirely to them. Thank you for staying with this story until its final lines. If Delaney's story touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, so that each day we can bring you more meaningful stories to experience together. How did this story make you feel? If you had been in peace, light that light on that rainy night, what would you have done? Please leave a comment. We truly want to hear the deepest feelings in your heart. May everyone watching this video be blessed with good health, happiness, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.